Do you remember that?
Good morning and welcome to Adult Forum. Rarely can you say that your speaker needs no introduction, but in this case, the speaker needs no introduction. So I was listening to it's our pastor, Ryan Young, but just a quick thought on pilgrimages and maybe I have that mic on or some feedback. I was listening to a podcast this week, a bit of optimism, Simon Sinek. If you haven't listened to that, it's interesting one. And Arthur Brooks from the Harvard Business School was on it, but it was fascinating. And one of the aspects of this was they were talking about arrival fallacy, and whenever you are, in this case, it was an Olympic gold medalist. Once they reach their medal and they win their gold, there's almost an inevitable depression that follows it, and sometimes clinical depression. And it was thought of just the value, finding value in the journey, in the sport, in doing it. When you reach the end, it's not what there's, as I had one runner friend say after a incredible athletic feat, I climbed the mountain, but I didn't find anything at the top that wasn't already in me. And so just thus the value in the journey. And so that's a little bit, I think, just we're going to hear particularly about Ryan's pilgrimage, but pilgrimages in world religions, Shintoism, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity. And your recent visit to one of the oldest Christian locations I did not know much about, honestly, until you went. So look forward to hearing about what you learned on your pilgrimage, what you might learn. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Paths Well Worn, Reflections on a Spiritual Pilgrimage to Iona.
Well, good morning. Glad to see everybody. I am very glad to be back, but I am just now back. I got home yesterday at 4:15 p.m. to the airport and home to my house about an hour after that. So, yeah, I'm still unpacking in more than one way and certainly recovering from some significant travel. So if I say things that don't make sense, just say, hey, Ryan, you're not making sense. And I'll say, oh yeah, sorry, I'm still on a different time zone. But I'm very glad to reflect a little bit with you on what I just spent the last about 11 days doing, and offer some things for us to kind of unpack together in this space and take with us from here. So let me begin by just explaining where I was, what I was doing, and why I was doing any of it. So in January of this year, Mia, my wife, as many of you know, and should be here in this room in a few minutes, she and I went on a retreat together as part of something called the Helping Pastors Thrive initiative through the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina, which has been my denominational home for many years. And at the end of that retreat, they announced, and that retreat itself was all about journey and pilgrimage and kind of spiritual engagement of journey. And at the end of that retreat, they announced this forthcoming trip to Iona, where they would take about a dozen people, ministers from North Carolina, attached to the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, to Iona, which is a place I had known about for about 15 years and had very much wanted to go in a country, Scotland, that I've always wanted to connect to. It's where much of my family heritage is. And so I knew that when they made the announcement for that trip, that I leaned over to me and I said, I need to go on that trip. And actually, that was before I started talking to you all about being here. So it's before this journey began. But I applied and was accepted to be one of what ended up being 13 ministers from the state of North Carolina to travel together and spend 6 nights together on the island of Iona, on the west side, coastal side of Scotland, and have this pilgrimage journey together to just experience what is there, to do that in a group collaborative space, but then also to do that alongside people from all over the world. And I'll explain that in just a minute. But the invitation was also to go and use the time on either side of that group trip how you would like to. And so I spent about 2.5 days in the city of Edinburgh before going to Iona, and had a little bit of time to do some of my own individual journey there before gathering with a group on Friday evening in Glasgow. Yeah.
And it's, we can share on Zoom.
Yeah.
We failed to do so.
That's fine.
Okay.
Do it.
Absolutely. But we need to unplug your laptop and have you join the meeting on Zoom from here.
Oh, okay.
So
Just a moment.
participants cannot see your presentation.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Nelson, unplug there, then.
So do I need to get on Zoom here?
Yeah, then join Zoom. And then share this same from Zoom.
Understood. Yeah. Yeah.
It'd be an adult forum if we didn't have the Navy tech issue.
Just blame it on your pastor. It's fine. So let's see.
We did have a quality pre-adult forum conversation.
To be fair, Nelson, you did send it to me. So join.
Good morning, Diane Naomi.
Hey.
Nice to see you again, David.
Do I need to have my audio on or leave that off?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what I figured.
on my father's side.
Share my screen, right?
What a minute.
Yeah, he's all right, huh? Good morning. Yeah. Dan's always good.
Sharing my screen
I live in. Yeah, it could be.
like that.
Oh, yeah.
There.
Wow.
Now we got to come back into here or no?
Don't get me started about this.
Okay.
Oh.
It's not.
All right, good in the room. Are we good? Nelson online?
Okay. Everybody online, you're good?
Dan.
I get thumbs up. Look at that. All right. So as I was saying, I was able to spend a couple of days in Edinburgh, which I'll talk briefly about, and then meet the group in Glasgow. And then Saturday morning, we spent the whole day getting to Iona. Iona is, again, it's one of the inner islands, what they call the Inner Hebrides, which are these outer islands of Scotland. The Isle of Mull is the first place you go to get there. And above that, you may have heard of the Isle of Skye, part of the Upper Highlands. So from Glasgow, you have to take a 3-hour train ride to the town of Oban, which is a coastal community on the west side of Scotland. And then you take about a 45-minute to an hour-long ferry to the Isle of Mull. And then you drive on a bus for an hour and a half across the Isle of Mull till you get to a little ferry port called Fionport. And then you take a 15-minute ferry to the island of Iona. So it is a flight, and then a train ride, and then a ferry, and then a bus ride, and then a ferry, and then you're there. So this is a faraway, remote setting. Although, as I was explaining to Mia this morning, there's about 200 people who live on the island of Iona permanently. So it's a community that is not just a pilgrimage site and a tourist destination, but it is, for some people, it is home, and it's where they live. And so there's a community there, there's a town there. But this is why I was doing this, was to go on this pilgrim journey individually, but with this group of primarily, this group was Baptist ministers from North Carolina, but we were there with people from all over the world. 2 men from Holland, several people from different parts of the UK, a young writer, a woman from Ireland, people from all over, and a few other Americans that were there. And we spent the 6 nights and the week on Iona in community together, living at the Abbey. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But this has been a bucket list item for me. And so I was thrilled to have the opportunity, but I also knew that I wanted to use it not just for myself, professionally, personally, but also to think about how does this experience connect to my work here, our work as a congregation, and our future opportunities, actually, which I'll talk about at the very end. But to begin with, let's just start with this prayer of awareness. So if I can offer this for you, and then we'll have a shared response right after this, and then we'll kind of lead into the presentation proper. But if you would give yourselves a moment just to be still and hear these words of awareness as we begin. And this is from the worship book, the Iona Abbey worship book that I wanted to share with you. Awake, O my soul, and know the sacred dignity of your being. Awake to it in every living soul this day. Honor it, defend it, in heart and mind, in word and deed. Awake, O my soul, and know the sacred dignity of your being. Awake, O my soul, awake. If you'll read and respond in the bold. Gathered together, not knowing what we have in common, not sure perhaps why we are here, unable to read God's mind. Come, Holy Spirit, to open doors, dispel fears, establish friendships, reveal what is in us, and bring us closer to Christ. Come, Holy Spirit,
Meet us here.
So one of the things we were able to do, where that came from, was worship together as a community in the Abbey at Iona, and so I'll talk about that in a minute. But that's where some of those kind of Celtic traditional spirituality pieces have come from. But as I told you, I began my journey in the city of Edinburgh, which is a remarkable ancient and modern city all at once. And this is just one image from there. We're going to talk about the Celtic cross a little bit, but one of my first encounters in the city was this spot. And I'll tell you, every picture that's used in this presentation are pictures that I took on this journey, just so you know that this was a part of what I did and not just things pulled from the internet. But this is one of many Celtic crosses I encountered on this journey. And this is in the background, Edinburgh Castle, which is a remarkable place. And Edinburgh has all of its own history, and I'm not going to go into that space, but I did want to tell you two things that I encountered in Edinburgh, which this was part of that, was finding the ways that even what I experienced on Iona and where things like the Celtic cross began on Iona were encountered in Edinburgh and other places, and we encounter them now. But also I had the great privilege of going into St. Giles Cathedral, which is kind of the primary cathedral in Edinburgh as part of the Church of Scotland historically, and this is beautifully remarkable space. But before I went, Beth Geddes Sturkey, who you all know, told me the story about this stool. And if you look very closely in that description, the woman it's describing is a woman named Jenny Geddes. This is one of Beth's ancestors who is famous for throwing this stool at the priest of St. Giles Cathedral, because there was this threat that the Church of Scotland would be basically claimed by the Church of England, and they would convert all of what they were doing as a people of faith to somebody else's way of doing. And she was protesting the change in their church and their way of being church. And so there's this image where she picked up the stool and threw it at the priest in declaration of her outrage. And they have memorialized this in St. Giles Cathedral. And so Beth was very glad to tell me that her ancestors, her lineage is that of those causing trouble in the church. And so I'm very glad that she's our council president to cause trouble here with us all these years later. But I say that playfully. But this was just a very cool part of being in Edinburgh and beginning my journey together. But let me begin by telling you about what really makes Iona special, because then from Edinburgh, as I said, I met with this group of 12 other ministry folks from North Carolina, and we started in Glasgow and went to Iona. But before we go much further, it's why is Iona important? Why does this matter? Why is it a pilgrimage place? And it really begins before this, but it's mostly significant related to someone named Saint Columba. Anybody familiar with Saint Columba? Have you heard this name before? Maybe one hand or so. So here are just some basic facts about Saint Columba. And there are legends and lores about Saint Columba, because as there often are with people from a great distant past. But essentially he was born in Ireland many, many years ago in the 500s, and began his early education under a monk and a priest of the day, and was working early on in Ireland to help establish and further Christianity in that space. But as the story is told, one of the things that he was well known for, as were many monks of the day, is replicating some of the early works of kind of publicated materials, like the Book of Kells and some other things, kind of creating these images of historical Christianity. They were doing this work, and he got into this argument over the rights over one piece of work. It led to this fight, this battle, which actually led to loss of life. And one of the ways the story goes is as his penance almost for what has happened was to leave Ireland and go to another part of the world to convert as many people to Christianity as had died in this battle. That's one way the story goes. And so there are other stories, but ultimately he exiled to Scotland. He left Ireland. He went to a first island initially that was too close. He could still see the coast of Ireland, so he went further and landed on Iona, and we'll talk about that more. But he took 12 companions with him to reflect on the 12 disciples of Jesus. So here was this early kind of Celtic Christian Irish monk who had left Ireland, had found this way to this island in Scotland, and took a group of companions with him. And when he got to Iona, he founded the Iona Abbey, which is a remarkably significant place in the spread of Celtic Christianity and Christianity in general. It's also where I stayed for the week, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But from there, he would take these missionary journeys, these evangelism journeys to other parts of Scotland and the UK. Back then, Scotland would have been Pictland, the Picts, and he went to go converting even the king brood of the Picts to Christianity and helping establish faith across the Scottish Highlands and across the UK, doing what he had been sent to do, convert as many or more people to Christianity as had been lost in this battle he was connected to once upon a time. But as I mentioned, he was a scholar and scribe. He was copying manuscripts by hand. There is some legend of the Book of Kells being put together in part on Iona, and him being a part of that. And then he ultimately died on Iona, and it was as a feast day, was sainted, has been memorialized in many ways, and has this enduring influence as one of the patron saints of Celtic Christianity, of Ireland, Scotland. The Celtic tradition is beyond Ireland and Scotland. It goes into Wales and other parts of the UK. But he's one of the patron saints because of some of this work of spreading not just Christianity and converting those, but also the work he did of copying manuscripts and quite literally spreading the work of Scripture and the Gospels all around. So that's who we're kind of talking about when we go to Iona and thinking about why is it significant. It's largely because of the work of Saint Columba, who helped make Christianity more widespread across Scotland and the UK, and is one of the patron saints of this particular place and this particular expression of religion, Christianity. It was about 563 that he came to Iona, and there are still some remnants of his early days there, which is pretty remarkable. Here are some expressions of St. Columba just that were around. The wire sculpture on the left up here originally was a stone sculpture that fell down, and they recreated this sculpture out of this artistic wire rendering, which I thought was incredible. And that's in the Abbey of Iona, and then one of the windows there, and then an artistic rendering of the window. But lots connected to the tradition of Iona, or tradition of St. Columba. One of those is the tradition of the high crosses. Anybody familiar with these high crosses? You've seen these images before. The one on the left is St. John's cross. It is kind of the original Celtic cross. So now, if we think about Celtic Christianity, the symbol we think of is this ringed Celtic cross. This began on the island of Iona. And once upon a time, this cross stood in front of the abbey, but because the way it was constructed, it was obviously very top-heavy. It fell over and it broke, but they reconstructed it with an artistic way. And this is the museum on the island of Iona, which is quite remarkable. But you'll see another one that still stands in front of the Abbey of Iona that's been standing there for about 1,400 years, and it still stands today. But these are the early high crosses, and a little bit to say more about that. And I'll read this for you because it's a little hard to see. But it says, the remarkable sculptures, which we've seen here, were an ambitious new way of celebrating the glory of God and conveying key Christian messages to the faithful. Created here from the 700s, they are known as St. Oran's, St. John's, and St. Matthew's crosses. The high crosses show hints of experimentation, a clue that this form was first developed here on Iona. The tallest is the mighty St. John's cross. Thought to be the first ever Celtic cross, it has a distinctive ring added to support the weight of its enormous arms. Despite this innovative problem solving, St. John's collapsed twice in the 1900s. The brethren may have been a little too ambitious with this one. But the fourth high cross, dedicated to St. Martin, has stood in its original location outside the Abbey Church for more than 1,200 years, excuse me, not 1,400. But that's the one here on the bottom left that still stands to this day. So early expressions of how these early Christians and these early monks were trying to demonstrate an expressiveness to God and to their devotion to God, reaching upward and downward and outward to express Christianity. So one of the things that makes Iona significant is this early development of these high crosses, which is quite remarkable. But as I mentioned, when he arrived in 563, Columba and his 12 companions, they established the monastery there. And one of the early things they did, these were some of the first people to establish grave sites with a sign of a cross on a gravestone. This began here, and they have a gravestone that's likely connected to those early 13 people that is still there in the museum. It's one of the earliest carved stones in recorded Christian history in that area, which is pretty remarkable. But this is the Abbey of Iona that has been built and rebuilt many times. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But this is still a place of worship every morning and every night. There is worship in the Abbey of Iona, 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., and it's open to anyone from anywhere. And then on Sunday, they have a communion service that takes place. But this is still an active place of worship, but it's also a place of community and to work and to live. So we actually stayed here with about 25 other people, and it's a pretty remarkable space. This is the cloisters inside the Abbey, just to get you a little more of an image of that. But here is an archive picture of the Abbey after it had been partially destroyed and before it was rebuilt in the 1930s, the living section. But the Abbey part still stood at that moment. You can see the crosses down there still standing. But Iona itself, so in addition to St. Columba being there, just some things about Iona to tell you about. As I mentioned, it's a tiny island, accessible only by ferry in the Inner Hebrides of Western Scotland, off the coast of Mull. It's about 3 miles long, which I have walked every part of that, and 1 mile wide. Early inhabitants go back to the Iron Age, so even before Columba was there. But arrival of St. Columba, as we've already discussed, birthplace of Scottish Christianity, from here spreading throughout that area. The Abbey, the current stone abbey dating to the 12th century, built by Benedictine monks, remarkable place. Many historians believe the world-famous Book of Kells, this illuminated manuscript of the Gospels, some of you may have seen this beautiful expression of the Gospels, was begun in Iona before moving to Ireland. There were Viking raids that took place, and actually many of the monks who lived there early on were slaughtered by the Vikings as they came, and they destroyed the abbey, and they were trying to seek some of the treasures of ancient Ireland and of ancient Christianity. So many of them were actually moved to Ireland during those Viking raids. So I mentioned several brutal attacks by the Vikings. There's a beautiful beach, which I'll show you a picture of, called the White Strands of the Monks Beach, where they believe many of the monks were killed by Vikings as they approached the island, which is quite devastating. Many important burial places there. And then in the 20th century, in about 1930s, a man named George MacLeod came and wanted to reconstruct a Christian community on the island. And so to this day, there still is an expression of this Celtic Christian tradition called the Iona community, made up of members and associate members all over the world, many of whom come and spend their time volunteering and working at the Abbey of Iona. So the Abbey of Iona is the physical structure is owned by the Historic Environment of Scotland, the Historic Trust of Scotland, and they maintain the exterior, but the interior and all of its worship and its lodging and its expressions are run by and maintained by the community, the Iona community. It's a really interesting partnership between the country and the worshiping community. But that began in the 20th century and it's still going to this day, devoted to peace, justice, and worship. And that's who led us through our week while we were there. And then today, as I mentioned, this number is a little bit higher now. It's probably around 180, up to maybe as many as 200 people who live on the island. But especially during the summer, as I was explaining to my 6-year-old daughter this morning, the puffins arrive in the late spring and summer. And there's much to see in the beautiful weather of the summer. So there's a lot of tourists during that time, but thousands of visitors and pilgrims each year come to be a part of this remarkable place. So let me pause there because I've said a lot to you already about Columba and about Iona. I wanted to give you just some brief overview stuff. I am not an expert. I was there for 6 nights. I'm still learning. But do you have any questions or clarifications before I continue on, just about what is this place, who was connected to it, why it's significant, or anything I've mentioned so far? Great. Well, if you do, please pause and ask if you have clarifying questions or if you want me to try to explain anything further, I'd be happy to. So this is our group, except I learned later, actually, one person was missing because he didn't get the memo. We were gathering for a group picture. That's me. I was like, where's Josh? Josh was not in that picture. But this was our group, 12 of the 13 of us, standing in front of what is actually a concrete cast replica of St. John's Cross there in front of the Abbey. So different kinds of ministers and clergy persons from North Carolina, from chaplains to spiritual directors to pastors to different folks. I was very glad to be there. That was one of our last days. This is where we gathered in community for our meals each day. So part of the experience of being on the island, you can go and stay in a hotel. You can go and stay in a bed and breakfast. But one of the special things you can do is go and actually stay at the Abbey and be a part of a living and working and worshiping there. And so you have communal meals together, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Everybody who stays at the Abbey has a task while you're there, much like the monks of old would have had work while they were there. So I cleaned bathrooms every morning that I was there, just like I do at home. Yeah, just like I do at home. Not true. Maybe one day. But we all had a task, and some people were vacuuming, some people were cleaning bathrooms, some people were helping prepare meals, some were doing laundry. About 30 minutes of our morning, just to do a task, to work together, to make the work of the Abbey still go. But we would gather around these long picnic table style tables, and midweek when everybody was there, that room was full. There was probably about 35 people or so, again, from all over the world. There for all kinds of reasons, and I'll tell one quick story. A man named Andrew from London came, whose voice I could listen to for the rest of my life. Just this deep, resonant, wonderfully British accent voice. He came by himself. He's probably nearing 80 years old, and said that he was there because over his life he had lost his faith. And he was hoping that he would find it in some way on Iona. His wife is a Christian and practicing her faith, and he felt like he at least owed it to her, if not to himself, to try to find his faith on Iona. But he was doubtful. He was very doubtful. Andrew was the first to leave at the end of the week just because of his schedule. And he stood up to say before he left, I came here with no faith, but I'm leaving with a great deal more. And he said it was largely because of the shared experience of being together with Christians from all over the world and talking about the different way that Christian faith looks and lives and is expressed, and people's different reasons for being and people's different doubts and expressions of this. And so it's pretty remarkable that even over 6 nights and these basically 6 days, people's lives were transformed in some small way. But this is where we would gather, and this is our very first gathering in that space, or getting oriented to the community there at Iona. This is one of the worshiping spaces. This is the small chapel on the backside where we spent some time together as a group. Just a beautiful expression. It's one of the oldest spaces on the island, and was a beautiful place to sit and reflect right on the ocean there. But then we would worship in the full Abbey itself. It didn't get a lot of pictures of our worshiping time together, but we would gather. I mean, we all are familiar with the kind of stylistic structure of the cross form of a chapel or abbey or cathedral, much like what Duke Chapel looks like. But we would worship in this space together, again, every morning at 9, every evening at 9, and then on Sunday morning we did a full service with communion, which was quite lovely. One of the great gifts of being there was we had a chance to, on Wednesday night, I believe, participate in a traditional Scottish ceilidh, which in Gaelic or Gaelic is not spelled anything like the way you think the word ceilidh sounds. But it's basically an opportunity to express in song, in spoken word, and dance, different gifts that we have. And so we did that, and I shared a piece of music from the piano and from singing. Some of you know that I'm a musician by background. And afterwards, one of the coordinators of worship said, "Hey, would you like to play music for worship tomorrow morning?" I said, "Yes, please." So I went up to the sacristy loft where this piano was, and I played the piano music for worship the next morning in Iona Abbey, which will forever be one of my most special musical experiences. And so that's where I was. But we got to experience worship there together every morning and every night, which was quite beautiful. In addition to the monastery being there, there was a nunnery. And this is the remains of the nunnery that was there. It has not been rebuilt. It was destroyed over time. But it's as historic and ancient as the monastery was. And so basically to go from the ferry and through town back to the abbey, or you walked through this nunnery site, which was this beautiful reflection of both the men and women who were on the island pursuing their faith in God and working to develop a sense of spirituality and tradition, which was quite beautiful. Part of what is remarkable about this place is the beauty of its landscape. This is just me walking down the road and looking over to my left. And there's no native wildlife to Iona. All the wildlife that's there, all the creatures that are there now are not native wildlife. They're sheep and cattle that have been brought there to just be a part of what's happening on the island. So as you would expect in Scotland, there are sheep and cattle everywhere. But just these beautiful pastures and sunsets and hills is just a remarkable part of the beauty of Iona. I mentioned the island is about 3 miles long and about 1 mile wide. On the south end of the island is called St. Columba's Bay, and it's the place where they believe Columba would have initially arrived there, coming from Ireland, the south, reached the south part of the island in this beautiful place called St. Columba's Bay. The entire beachfront is stone. It's not sand beach, it's a stone beach. And over time, a group of someones, created this stone labyrinth. Are you familiar with the labyrinth? Anybody know what a prayer labyrinth is? So it's a way it's an expression of prayer done by walking what looks like a maze, but there's only one way in and one way out. And it's about finding your way to the center, ultimately, both spiritually and quite literally. And it's an expression of prayer, of an inward movement, a centering expression, and an outward movement. It's one of my favorite. If you come into my office, there's a wooden labyrinth hanging above my desk. That was a gift. But there was one there, and I had this chance to walk the labyrinth. When I approached this spot after about an hour and 20-minute hike to get there, there was only one other person there, and he was walking the labyrinth. He was walking barefoot, which I thought was beautiful. So once he was done, I took my shoes off to be kind of in a holy ground space and walk the labyrinth. And I had this beautifully spiritually expressive moment and this wonderful moment of my own kind of spiritual centering. But then it was hijacked a bit because the man who was walking that path came over to me and had an interaction. It was tearful and it was lovely and beautiful. But he's a well-known British actor who was in Game of Thrones and in the new show 1923 and in John Wick. His name is Jerome Flynn. If you saw the show Game of Thrones, he was Bronn of the Blackwater, but he was on a pilgrimage. And Jerome and I had a special spiritual tender moment on this island bay by ourselves. And it was just kind of this remarkable experience, but he came over to me, he put his hand on my shoulder, he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "Brother, this is a holy place." So, well, it's even more holy now because you're here. And so, but it was very cool. It was a very neat space. Yeah. No, please.
But my my understanding is obviously it's ecumenical Christian, and also does it have a well-known reputation kind of thing for being one of the thin spaces.
We're going to talk about that at the yeah, we're going to land on thin spaces. Yeah.
He was at his
Correct.
spiritual journey, but certainly he perhaps was really at a juncture and he was aware this is a thin space where some people
Yes.
feel a real presence of God in a unique way.
Yeah, and thank you. That's where we're gonna land today, is this Celtic expression, this idea of thin places. And to be serious for a moment about that, Jerome was on a deep pilgrimage, and my friend Stuart that I met on this trip actually had an encounter with Jerome that was even more significant. They talked for quite a while. I don't think Jerome would self-identify as a Christian, but certainly as somebody deeply spiritual. But it was his third trip to Iona, and he comes there for some level of spiritual centering because it is such a remarkably unique space. And so we'll talk about what thin space means and why that's especially true here. But that's exactly right. I mean, I kind of said that somewhat humorously, but the experiences we all continue to have of encountering the divine in unique ways in another person, in a place, in a moment. Everybody from that trip has multiple of those expressions from this trip. So,
One,
Yeah.
well, the Celtic cross,
Yeah.
a little bit, like you said, I mean, it's a heavy.
Just repeat it.
Oh, say the Celtic cross is obviously, the stone is very ornate, unique, and there's even, I think, inscriptions in the stone, on
Yeah.
the stone
Yeah.
from Desert Brothers from Egypt. But the ring part, what you described of just connecting with the beauty of God in nature, that part of the ring is, to my understanding of the redemption of God and recreation of God in nature, in creation. So that's just something to add to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and here towards the end, I'm going to talk a little more about what Celtic Christianity represents and symbolizes, and a lot of it is this deep connection to the sacred within ourselves, and it's awakening. We did the prayer of awakening at the beginning to the sacredness of everything else around us, including creation and one another. And so, yes, these are ideas that we're going to continue to unpack, but I'm glad you're pointing them out because there's so much depth and symbolism to everything that's happening in not just this space, but in what it represents, which is quite beautiful. So as is part of what I love about the labyrinth. Here's just another angle of that labyrinth where you can see the path in and the path out and where I came from to get there. Probably a dozen times I saw an image like this one, but this was what you can't see on the screen, probably because of the contrast, is it's a full double rainbow. I sent this picture to Mia when I took it, and to several other people over time, just because, in fact, it's one that our group there together now uses, because I was the only one on top of the island on the mountain at that moment. Everybody else was down near the Abbey. I just gone on a hike by myself, so they all saw parts of this, but I was in an isolated place to see the entire thing. I was on the highest point on the south side of the island, and this was my image as I came back. And over and over and over again, because of the environment there, the geography of the place, there are prolific number of rainbows everywhere. But for me, it was this reminder of God's promise, just over and over again, of making all things whole and making all things new and the redemption of all things. So just a remarkable reminder as we were there of that. One of the statues that has been created on the island over time was the sculpture of the fallen Christ, which I thought was a beautiful expression of remembering Christ's own journey towards the cross and the sacrifice of that moment. And so this is just a beautiful depiction of the fallen Christ that was there on the island. There are several what are called cairns on Iona, which are these little rock, almost like pyramids of sorts on high places on Iona to symbolize this sacredness of the space. This one is called the Cairn of the Back to Ireland. And it's believed that it's where, when Columba first arrived, he found this high place and he turned his back to Ireland to begin turning his face towards something different. And there's another one on the north side of the island on Dun E, which is the highest point of Iona altogether. It's only about 400 feet because it's an island. It's not terribly high. But this was a place that you had to really want to get to. I'm going to talk about paths, and paths well worn was the name I gave this presentation. This was not a place with a path well worn. You had to find your way here, and it was well worth it, but it took a while. So this is on Dun E. This is on the north part of the island, looking down at the Abbey and back at the bay. What you see across the water is the Isle of Mull. So this is how far away Iona is from the rest of the Inner Hebrides, from the Isle of Mull. It's not far. It's about, you can actually see where to the right of the Abbey, I can see some construction happening. They're creating a breakwater there for the ferry landing. So you just take the ferry across. It's about a, I don't know, 10-minute ferry ride. But that's where it is, but it's remote, but it's still connected to the rest of the land from there. This is the south side of the island again. This is actually from the top of the mountain looking back to Columbus Bay. To me, this was just this beautiful place where you're on top of the island. You don't really see anything else until you get to this moment and the rocks part, and there's this valley and this bay that opens up to what became probably the most significant space for me while I was there that whole week. But you can kind of see the path carved down through to, and those are sheep down there just grazing down in the bay. It took me an hour and 15 minutes to get to them. So I don't know who's tending those sheep, but they're there. This is the north side of the island. This is the white strands of the Monk Beach. So very different scenery there. The south part of the island is all rocks. The north part is this fine white sand, this beautiful, beautiful beach. But it's where the Vikings would have attacked and where several monks lost their lives. But it's this very beautiful, it's actually the first rainbow I saw on the trip was standing on this beach on a very beautiful day. So just beautiful scenery and topography and just a beautiful place. I'm going to shift a little bit just because of our time and because of what I want to get to about kind of what makes Celtic Christianity, some of its unique attributes. Again, this is an expression of Christian life that came from Ireland, moved to Scotland, and then into the rest of the Celtic world in the UK through primarily the work of St. Columba and some of his followers. But here are just a few distinctions about Celtic Christianity I think are worth acknowledging. The first is this deep connection with nature. We're not going to get into a big theological debate today, but if you go back in time, to the debate between Augustine and Pelagius, which is early theological thought around many things, but one of those is an idea of things like original sin and sacredness of life from the beginning. And Pelagius and Augustine did not agree with one another. And in the theological debate, Augustine won, so to speak. But part of the debate was whether or not where our kind of sacredness lies, and that there's the one way of thinking that there's this original sin that we're all born with that has to then be reconciled over time. But the Celtic tradition expressed through many like Pelagius is that creation is sacred from its beginning and in its origin and its center. And what has to happen over time is the corruption of sin over time, but that our redemption comes in reawakening the sacred within ourselves to the sacred in everything else, not just other people, but in creation. And that there is a sacredness of the divine, that the created world is all in the image of God. All is made from God, and therefore all is sacred. And there's a sacredness within everything that not simply, but needs to be reawakened to the sacredness of myself, to the sacredness of you, the sacredness of us, to the sacredness of the world, right? The beauty of everything. And so they have this deep connection with nature. Creation is sacred, God's beauty and presence woven into prayers and art. It's a big part of the Celtic tradition. Another is a love of learning and scripture. Again, I mentioned that part of what they would do is copy manuscripts and art and study the Bible and preserve these classical texts. The Book of Kells was not meant to replace the Gospels. It was meant to highlight them differently. This is a time where people don't just have a Bible they can pick up and read, right? So there's these expressions of making the imagery and the beauty and the symbolism and the truth of Scripture made known. And so they had this love of learning in Scripture. There was a monastic focus. St. Columba came from a monastic tradition in Ireland, continued a monastic tradition in Scotland. It's where a lot of these abbots and this community life was developed. So you see that abbey life, which still continues in some way through this Iona community. A missionary zeal. So obviously the spreading the gospel and taking it to different places. So Columba and his follower Alden, and then St. Patrick. Obviously we know St. Patrick for some of his legends, like getting all of the snakes out of Ireland, which it's not actually how that happened, but it's a great story. But those who were spreading the beauty of the story of Scripture and the story of Jesus through Ireland and Scotland and then beyond is a big part of the Celtic tradition. Distinct spiritual practices, poetic and earthly prayers, fasting, confessions, psalms, singing, all of these things. And then this holistic view of faith. Again, no sharp divide between sacred and secular. There was this Gnosticism that was existing in the early days of Christian life. If you go back through Christian history, there were those who believed that the sacred and the secular were completely removed from one another. There was this distinct divide between the sacred and basically the heavenly and the worldly. And others who pushed back on that, like the Celtic tradition, was to say, no, there is a sacredness interwoven into everything. What we have to do is re-find the sacred center of all things. That in Christ, there was both a humanity and a divinity together. There are some who believe, like even the Gnostics, who would say, no. Anything about Christ was and his divinity and his humanity were completely separate, and maybe there wasn't a connection, which is part of the argument there. But the Celts would say, no, everything that is secular has a sacredness to it. We just have to help refine the sacred center of all things. It's not to say that there isn't evil. It's not to say that there isn't other, but finding the connection of the sacred and the integrating work, prayer, creativity into all of these things. It's a really beautiful expression. Now, one of those, there are two kind of soul thinkings about Celtic Christianity that I want to touch on as we near our ending space, and give us some time to talk about them. But part of how they thought about the soul was its relationship and its connection to other people and other places. And so one of those is this idea of a soul friend, what they would call the anam cara. And the idea of a soul friend is someone who is helping us to further the deepening of our soul and our connection to God, who we're able to be connected to in a intimate way, not romantic intimacy, but spiritual intimacy, to help continue to point us to God, point us to our true self. And many of these would have been, particularly in the monastic tradition, essentially like a mentor. And so many believe that the monastic mentor of St. Columba, who sent him to Scotland, would have been his anam cara, his soul friend, to say, to redeem your soul, to further your soul, go and do this work on behalf of God to not just save the world, but to save yourself, and was able to speak to him honestly, to say, look, you screwed up. Now go make that well in the world. Go devote the rest of your life to spreading this work everywhere you go. So they believed in our soul's connection to other people in a really powerful way. That our group spent some time thinking about where do we have these soul connections in our lives, and how is that important? And so the other idea, though, is this idea, I mentioned nature and the beauty of the rocks all over the island. Part of their belief is that even there's a sacredness even to the rocks, and the scripture of even the rocks will cry out, if we're not the ones saying things. There's a deep spirituality and sacredness to some of the stones of the island. Forgot that was there. But this expression of thin places. So we've already heard a little bit about that. Anybody else aware of this expression of thin place? Is this familiar? How would anybody else describe, if you would be willing to, what is a thin place? Just simply put, anybody have an expression of that? And if not, I can give you my version, but is there a
God moments. God moments.
God moments?
You're in your relationship with people, what you're experiencing in your life, how other people respond to what they see you're experiencing.
Yeah. Our microphone's having a thick moment, not a thin moment. So.
Heaven meets earth.
Heaven meets earth.
Yeah.
What'd you say about?
Not as
What?
not as saturated, but an unsaturated, where there's space opening up for the divine, the spirit.
Space opening up for the divine. It's not saturated with everything else that we can't find that, but there's a space open for the divine spirit to be revealed or experienced in some way. That's lovely. So one way that this was expressed was on Iona, and goes back a very long time. But it's this idea that the veil between heaven and earth is so thin, it's as if tissue paper. That there are spaces and places in our lives, in our world, where the veil between heaven and earth is almost as if it doesn't exist. And so for many, Iona is one of those places where you go and you think, I may be as close to the divine here as I've ever been. And it's not necessarily about geography, but about the divinity of the moment and the place. And so we talked a little bit about, as a group, this idea of not just thin places, but more so thin spaces, thin moments, the birth of a child, the death of someone, transitions in life, places you go where there's beauty beyond your comprehension, moments where you feel like God is here, right? I can feel it, I can hear it, I can know it. And so much of the Celtic tradition is this idea that there are these places, there are these spaces, these moments where it's as if the veil between heaven and earth is almost non-existent. And I was saying to Doug earlier that, sometimes trips you go on like this, and you mentioned this at the beginning, that kind of pilgrimage, that you go and you hope that there is this transformation that happens. There is this experience that you have that does make it feel like, pilgrim journey, by the way, is not the same thing as a tourist's trip. Tourists, there are some who would say, tourists go to see something new or experience something new. Pilgrims go to become someone new. It's about transformation. And so this idea of going and having this experience. And so for me, there was this anticipation, this expectation, something I've looked forward to for a very long time, that what if it doesn't meet that experience? What if I don't have this thin place moment? What if I don't experience God any differently there than I do standing right here? What if the experience of being there just doesn't meet my expectations? And that happens a lot, right? We go places we think, I'm so looking forward to this. And you're like, well, I don't know, that wasn't as good as I thought it would be. It's kind of how Disney World is for me, but not a thin place for me. This is one of those experiences that far surpassed my expectation. And that was through moments that truly, without any other way to explain it, were so overwhelmingly thin, they brought me to tears. Moments where I was as isolated as I've been in a very long time and felt completely connected, if that makes sense. Ways that help me see myself differently, see my family and my life differently, see God differently, recognize a dependence on a creator that I needed a reminder of, And so for me, Iona, but more so, and we gathered as a group, not just our 12, our 13, which we pointed out, by the way, that we took a group of 13 and Columba took a group of himself and 12 others, 13. It's very interesting. But the group of about 35 of us from all over the world gathered the last night to talk about our experience. While everybody talked about the beauty of the place and the meaning of the place, everybody talked about the most significant part of that trip was the community aspect of being together with these other people. But the thin place, perhaps most of all, was in our connecting with, there was a woman there who was 86 years old, who had been going to Iona every year since 1992, I think she said. Her name is Margaret, and we started calling her Saint Margaret because she just had this wisdom about her and this beauty about her, of just her being there for so long. But our experience was one of finding the divine in so many places, in one another, in these physical, this place, this is the Bay of the St. Columba's Bay, this is the Rock Beach, this is the Labyrinth. I had to go back. It's a mile, it's an hour and 15 minutes just to get there, over mountains and terrain and sheep pasture, and it's not easy, but I had to go back. And so I went back a second day, and I just spent about an hour down there. And as I walked back the second day, that's when I found the double rainbow, and I thought, okay, this is worth it. But we have these experiences where we are made, where it's made realized for us that there are thin places in this world. And again, it doesn't have to be a plane and a train and a ferry and a bus and a ferry away. I mean, the hospital room where our 3 children were born, that's a thin place, right? We have these experiences with people and places that are deeply remarkable. So with just a couple of moments to spare, a couple of you, anybody, do you have an experience of a thin place that you can speak to, whether it's a moment or a physical place or a relationship that is that, or an anamkara? Anybody have an expression of these things that you would name just very quickly? That's a vulnerable thing to ask of you, so you don't have to, but is this resonating with anybody, that there's been a place in your life, a moment in your life where you think, God is so close, I can reach through the veil and touch the divine?
Yeah. Many of you know I've just experienced the death of my brother. And I had a Christian sister here from the congregation at Duke Chapel that accompanied me to Cleveland.
Yeah.
She accompanied me to be a support. We experienced many thin places on that trip.
Yeah. Saint Bridget is one of the saints of liminality, these in-between places we find ourselves, or of thresholds, these transitional spaces, and life and death, and the transitions of that, and our people who accompany us are these soul spaces and thin places. Yeah.
I found the location where one of my ancestors in Gloucester, England, had gathered together little hamlets and created an estate in his lifetime.
Oh.
And I found the church where they worshiped, which was not too far away. And I couldn't find their graves. But when I walked that land and I sat in those pews, the ancestors were weirdly present. And when I say weirdly, you don't expect these things. You're just like, I want to go see where they live.
Yeah.
It happens.
Yeah.
It just happens. You can't plan it.
And you can hardly explain it.
No. And
Right.
then the other one was walking around Canterbury Cathedral.
Yeah.
And coming upon this area just before you could leave go into the cloisters. And I just had this chill about me. And I was like, why? And as I looked around this small space, I realized there's a sign. And I read the sign, and it was where the Archbishop had been slaughtered by Henry's knights. So you just don't know when it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it wasn't haunted. It was just the feeling of something very tragic happened to a man who became very spiritual when he was anointed to be the Archbishop of Canterbury and go against his best friend, who was very worldly.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much so for sharing that. Because of our time, I want to just do 2 more things very quickly as we need to close. But I hope you'll give that some thought. Where have you experienced the divine, or experienced God in a way that feels like there's just this thinness between you and God, you in heaven? I would like us to go. I've already started talking to Beth Sturkey. I mentioned this, even though she's, in her ancestry, a rabble rouser. Just kidding. You can see the rainbow on the far side of the Abbey. Part of my journey was also to begin thinking about and planning for our own congregational pilgrimage in the near future, distant but near, to take a group from here to go experience Iona and some of those places. So I want you to know today that we'll begin working on that and planning that. And once there are more details, we will share that with the congregation and take a group, maybe of 13, to Iona. So stay tuned. And then the last thing would just be a closing response as we go to worship together in this moment. If you'll read the bold. May the blessing of light be upon us. Light without, light within. May the moon, sun, and stars shine on us and warm every heart till it glows like a great fire, so that strangers and friends may come in and find welcome. May light shine out from
our eyes,
like a
like
candle.
a candle set in the window.
May God
And may
bless
God bless us with goodness and loving kindness. Amen.
Go in peace. Thanks for being here.
And thank you, Ryan. Look forward to hearing more on the trip. Next week, we'll appear we have moved heaven and earth for you to make it easier instead of getting up at 0:30. To participate in class, the seasonal end of daylight savings time may light your way. Join us when Ian Mills, visiting assistant professor of classics and religious studies, Hamilton College, will inform us on the history of three in heaven, adding the Trinity to 1 John. All right, thank you.
Thank you.